Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber who asked a question about their core being a weakness on their big lifts, and I'll flip that in here for you guys. Basically, it's creating some confusion for this individual because he's like, look, everyone always says that the big lifts work your core tremendously. Any standing lift, any of that, whether it's an overhead press, deadlift, squat, whatever, it's going to work your core. But it seems like to me my core is underdeveloped, and I think it's a weak link in my lifts. How do we address this? Because a lot of people say you shouldn't need to train your core if you're doing all the big lifts. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this because this is a great question. And you know, this is a big controversy out there in the strength training world. This is something that's debated as far as how much core training you need, whether beltless training or any of that is good or bad. All right, this is a massive point of contention. It really is. But the thing that you need to understand is that from a functional perspective, from an athletic perspective, you cannot have a core that is too strong. You can have a core that's too weak, but having a core that's too strong is absolutely impossible. And yeah, the core gets worked on so many different big exercises, even when the muscles change around and different muscles are being used, that a weak core will absolutely limit everything that you do. In fact, that is one of the reasons that belts were developed, is because too many guys have too weak a cores, or they were trying to do too high of a workload and their core couldn't handle it, and they needed a way to substitute something in for that. Now, beltless training, studies on all this stuff, EMG studies, everything else, this is a point of major controversy. But one of the things that I believe, and again, this is anecdote, but it goes back to the point of how many top-level lifters in the world do not believe that belted training should be used year-round. Really, it's an interesting point because a lot of people out there who do belted training and are big advocates of it and honestly think that it makes their core stronger, they're not the ones setting world records. Just throwing that out there. And it is interesting, and it's not absolute proof because champions can do things wrong and still be champions, and people need to remember that. You can't always go by that, but when it comes to core strength as far as belted work goes, you look at guys like Jamie Lewis, Dan Green, guys who have both been in their weight class raw world record holders in powerlifting. They're both big advocates of spending at least half of the year training without a belt completely. And the truth is, a belt is a crutch as far as your core is concerned. Yes, training with a belt will make your core stronger when lifting with a belt, but when the belt is gone, there isn't always the full carryover that you would expect. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that if you build up to a 500-pound deadlift with a belt that you're going to have a weak core. You're probably not. But what you are going to find is that when that belt is gone, your core is going to be stronger than the average person, sure, but is it going to be as strong as someone who squats 450 without a belt? Not even close. And there have been plenty of examples of that. When any of these guys or other coaches who promote beltless training take the belt off athletes, what they find, their cores can't keep up. They can't actually squat or deadlift the heavy weight if they've been training with a belt all those years. That's something that has to be noted. And so if this whole idea that belts made your core stronger because they help it engage a certain way, then why when you pull the belt off someone who's been doing it does their core strength drop so tremendously? What I mean is you can take one guy who does a lot of beltless training who can squat 450, 460 pounds all the way down without a belt, who squats 500 as a max with a belt. But you can take another guy who is trained exclusively with a belt, who doesn't do beltless training, who also squats 500. He can't squat 450 when you take the belt off. In fact, there have been cases of this discussion coming up with coaches who've talked about athletes they've had who can squat 500 with a belt, who never do beltless training, and they take the belt off and they can only squat something like 350. That when they try to get them even near 400 pounds, they can't support the weight without a belt. So what I would suggest to a lot of people out there is that maybe your training with a belt is making your core weaker. Yeah, sure, you can engage the core better by pressing against the belt, but it doesn't give you carryover strength, and it doesn't give you the development that you might want. So ditching the belt is going to be real high on the list. It's going to be real high on the list. Another thing that you could do a lot more exercises that require you to strengthen your core. What I mean is, if your core is weak and you're doing beltless training, sure, you're thinking of squats, deadlifts, overhead press, all of that, sure, they work the core, but it's a limiting factor there. This is where things like bodyweight exercises come into play tremendously come into play, because we've got good EMG data out there showing that things like chin-ups, compared to other exercises for the lats, chin-ups actually engage the core tremendously more so. Weighted chin-ups build your core, but they're not a limiting factor in it. So, again, some of your supplemental exercises, start doing things like chin-ups, dips. These exercises actually engage your core. They engage your abs without them being a limiting factor. Once your core gets fatigued, you don't get stuck on these exercises, but they do play a strong stabilizing role in them. So more exercises that do utilize your core for more of your metabolic work, your assistance work, can help strengthen your core. All right, so that's another thing to look at. A lot of these big body weight exercises, they're amazing core builders. And the other thing to look at, the whole argument also comes up in a lot of circles that, well, if you're squatting heavy, you don't need to train your abs, But the thing you've got to look at is, well, what happens when your core does become the weak link? And that's very frequent. And again, that's very commonly seen when you see the massive difference between a belted and unbelt on some guys. All right, if your squat is 100 pounds apart with a belt versus without a belt, you have a weak core. You cannot even debate that point, because the whole point of a belt is to give you extra core support. So if there's 100 pounds difference between your belted squat and your unbelted squat, your core is absolutely a weak link. Absolutely. And I would say that's for 500 pound squat. If you're a guy who squats 400 with a belt and you struggle with, 325 without a belt, yeah, your core is weak. Your core is limiting your overall strength and development. And so in that case, I would tell guys, why don't you train your core? Why don't you train your core more? There's no reason not to do direct core work, given the fact that we know that the core can be the limiting factor on at least 5 or 6 major exercises. We know that the core can be a limiting factor out on field performance for athletes. It can be a limiting factor for even MMA guys. You can't, any contact sport, any sport that involves speed, power, or physical contact, having a weak core will absolutely destroy you in that sport. There's a reason so many boxers over the years have done so much ab work. So they can take a hit in the guts over and over and over without being worn down by it. So core strength is applicable to everything athletic, but particularly any sort of lifting sport or any sport that involves physical contact. You should be doing everything that you possibly can to have a stronger core. And you know what? Even for the average person who's out there training just for fitness, let's say you don't compete in anything, why would you want a weak core? Having a strong core will absolutely carry over to your safety. It will keep you from injuring your lower back. It'll reduce your chance of injuring your lower back. It will reduce your chance of slipping a disc during all sorts of activities, because you know what? People hurt their backs not just lifting things. People hurt their backs falling down. All right, falling down onto the ground. A stronger core will help protect your back. What if you get a little love tap by a car? All right, these things happen and you can't control that. People fall down. People get hit by cars every single day. Stronger core can help you have a little better chance of reducing a major injury to your back by doing that. So why wouldn't you want a stronger core? And what I would say to people, you got tons of people out there who are like, well, even though all the evidence out there shows that chin-ups are just as good as curls for biceps, I still do extra bicep work just because. Guys will do that, but they don't want to come in and do extra core work, really? Your core is probably the most important muscle group in your body. Like, having a weak core will make you a weak person. Having a weak core will subject you to higher injuries. It should be a top priority. So anyone who says, well, I squat and deadlift and all of this, so I shouldn't need to do core work, I would say to them, but you could be squatting and deadlifting more if you did some extra core work. Why don't you do some sport-specific core work to improve your squat and deadlift? You'll be stronger for it. You'll also have a lower injury rate, because people worry about their lower back on heavy deadlifts. Train your core more, it'll help. What I mean by specific work, how about standing core work? How about you get up and stand and do crunches with bands or cables? Stand in the same stance you would use on a deadlift or a squat and do crunches. You don't have to go all the way down if you don't want, but you can do crunches while standing. That will carry over tremendously to those exercises. And you know what? It takes a minute out of your day. You can throw some bands at the gym over any of the racks, anywhere, a chin-up bar, a cable crossover, whatever, and you can do some band crunches and be done in 60 seconds at the end of every workout and walk out the door. You know what? You do that for 6 months, it's going to make a tremendous difference in your core strength. It's going to carry over to your squat and deadlift. How about doing some weighted planks every now and then? Extremely functional for stabilizing building stability in your core. Well, stability in your core is going to help you on your squat, your deadlift, your overhead pressing. It's going to help stop it from being a limiting factor. There is no reason to ever have a weak core. The only guys who worry about too much core development are a lot of guys who are overly concerned with aesthetics and bodybuilding, and they're scared of a blocky waist or whatever. They're scared of a blocky waist, and so they go out of their way to avoid training their core with heavy weight excessively, and then they end up being weak and non-functional. But the thing is, you go look at some of the guys who they think had the most amazing bodies back in the day, golden era of bodybuilding and stuff, and some of those guys did hours and hours of core work every week. So where's your logic in that? Perfect example, like I can think of one guy off the top of my head, Serge Nubret. And I don't think any bodybuilders out there would think that he looked blocky or terrible. That guy was known for doing hours of core work every single week. Tremendous amounts of it. And it certainly didn't detract from his aesthetics in any way. So yeah, there's no reason not to train your core. It's probably the most important muscle group in your body to make sure that it gets the most work. So that's your abdominals, obliques, spinal erectors. I can't overemphasize that enough, how important it is to strengthen and develop those if you want to be well-rounded and have good fitness. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.